In 2019, John Ware, the hugely respected veteran television journalist, made a Panorama documentary, Is Labour Anti-Semitic? People who deny that Labour had an anti-Semitism problem under Corbyn's leadership tried to destroy Ware's reputation and the reputations of the whistleblowers who spoke out in his film. In 2022, Ware won a High Court libel case against press gang editor Paddy French. This is his story.
I was variously described as an Islamophobe, as engaging with the far right, and that I'd set out my preeminent motive for making this program was to prevent Corbyn becoming prime minister. I obviously wasn't displeased that he, as speaking personally, that he wasn't prime minister, but the notion that that was my motive or even entered into my head as a reason for doing the program is ludicrous. I'm a journalist, and we had a story. I had access to many hundreds of pages, which have never been published, of evidence about the scale of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. So we had a story, as I say, these allegations, as far as I was concerned, crossed the line, not just because they were determined to destroy my reputation, but also the reputation of the program and my colleagues. But crucially also because they sort of demeaned and belittled the anxieties of a great many Jews within the Labour Party, I don't think they would have dared. I mean, Corbynites they don't tend to understate their sort of moral rectitude, but I don't think any of them would have dared demean any other minority with such confidence. And this was very much a case of Jews not counting as much as other minorities, or not counting at all, really. No amount of rebuttal or explanation satisfied them, and therefore I said, well, I'll take you to court. That's what. So I sued the Labour Party, and I sued the Jewish Voice for Labour. Naomi Wimborne-Adrisi made an extraordinary outburst on the BBC about me, as I say, being part of the far right. I've made programs about the far right, and then there was a blogger called Paddy French, who came up with the most extraordinary allegations. I mean, one of the suggestions he made was that because my wife and my children happened to be Jewish, that was, a breach of the BBC's impartiality guidelines. And he also suggested that because we had used what appeared to him anyway to be a woman of British Muslim heritage, as he described her, to voice the Labour Party's responses to our allegations. That could have given the impression that Labour was more sympathetic to Muslims than to Jews. So this was the kind of weird conspiracist sort of mentality that we were dealing with. Anyway, French said it was very important to take this to court to test the allegations in the forensic setting of a court, as he put it. That was exactly what I wanted to do. The difference between us was that about 2 weeks before the court, he bottled it and said, well, after all, he wouldn't be contesting the allegations, having raised money from the likes of what's his name, the Pink Floyd founder, Roger Waters, a particularly poisonous individual. He'd had a lot of support from a few celebs like Ken Loach, some media academics He'd raised quite a lot of money. But anyway, he threw in the towel, said he wouldn't, in the end, after all, contest the allegations. And but he wouldn't either turn up in court. I was pleased to say the judge gave me a very solid judgment, awarded me quite a lot of money, much more than I was even asking for. Actually, I was never interested particularly in the money. I offered French a way out for a tiny sum of money in damages. I mean, just a nominal amount. He just had to make the right sort of apology and pay my legal costs. He didn't do that, so that was it. And he's now got a court order for a very large sum of money, which he shows every indication of not paying. So that's so this is not over. But anyway, that's the background to it. And it was it was good to win, good feeling. Yeah. And I suppose in the course of this, I did learn a lot more than I knew when I made the program. I learned quite a lot more about Jeremy Corbyn. I learned more about his office. There were some good people in his office. There were some bad people too, but there were one or two good people who tried to do the right thing, actually. I'm thinking particularly of Laura Murray and even Andrew Murray. There were occasions, I should say that in the course of this litigation, which I mean, I don't know whether any of you have ever litigated, but it is all consuming. I mean, it just soaks up all your time. And because I was having to deal with so many questions from the other side, I started to think, well, I'll write a book about the Corbyn years. And so I did. I got 4 chapters away, but every time I started to write, I got into the sort of my stride. In would come questions for another sort of 80, or literally on one occasion 87 questions, which I think was an attempt by Bindmans who were acting for Paddy French to sort of grind me down. So they got 180 odd pages back. But anyway, in the course of this, I started a research for a book, and I spoke to a number of people actually in Jeremy's office who I didn't think would speak to me, but actually did. The interesting thing about Jeremy is that he never really wanted. So when he was approached and told, when he was told by colleagues that he looked pretty certain to win the Labour Party ballot for getting on the leadership ticket back in 2015, he was approached by a couple of colleagues who said, "Look, Jeremy, I think you're going to win." And Jeremy's response was to say, "You better make effing sure I don't win." He didn't want to be a leader. He didn't want to be prime minister. But that reluctance dissipated as he went from venue to venue, and the crowds cheered him on, and we got all that sort of "Oh, Jeremy" stuff. He rather warmed to all that, and by the time he was elected, I think was in a much more positive frame of mind. Of course, in those months came the first questions about his background, and as you may remember, his response to questions about what he knew and when he knew about the anti-Semitic utterances of of the people he'd associated with was always, well, I as soon as I knew what they'd said, I disassociated myself from them. And I have to say that, I mean, one can't definitively prove any sort of negative, but looking very forensically as I did at the timelines, raised a number of questions. I'll give you an example. So, as some of you may recall, Jeremy attended a number of fundraising, a number of meetings with the Der Yassin Remembered organization, which was run by a guy called Paul Eisen, who was in his constituency. And Jeremy associated on and off, I don't think very regularly, to be fair to him at all, but on and off, till about 2013, 2014, and when he was asked about it, he said, "Well, that was, you know, only then did I get to hear about what Eisen was really like." And that may be true, but it's curious, is all I would say, because in 2007, Jeremy's former close associate Tony Greenstein had himself, who must be. And I think it's fair to say, based on the evidence that was given to the Labour Party, Greenstein must be one of the most disagreeable individuals I think I've ever set eyes on. I mean, the sort of stuff he came out with it's just unrepeatable. Anyway, even Greenstein objected to Paul Eisen's role in Der Yassin Remembered, and wrote a piece in The Guardian explaining why he thought he was an anti-Semite. Now, you know, The Guardian is Jeremy's favourite, his essential reading for Jeremy. And he was also an associate of Jeremy's. So how Jeremy missed that, I don't know, but maybe he did. You can't exclude it. But that's a sort of an example of how I think, and it kind of explains how Jeremy adopted this kind of how very dare you approach to any journalists who quizzed Jeremy. And it was this background that kept dogging him, and of course ate into any confidence that the Jewish community might have had about Jeremy's ability to deal with his will to deal with anti-Semitism. And I think that there were initiatives proposed to Jeremy by people like Andrew Murray and others, as the confidence of the Jewish community drained away. It was made clear to Jeremy that he needed to do something decisive, something that would resonate, that would feel credible to Jewish members of the Labour Party, and like going to Israel, like saying in terms why he understood Zionism, mattered to Jewish people. What he said about Israeli governments thereafter wouldn't matter too much, but he had to kind of, he had to get to first base. And my understanding is that Jeremy would nod and say, well, yes, that sounds like a good idea, and would go away, and nothing would happen. And no one really, or at least the people I spoke to, no one really had a sort of answer as to why nothing happened, except the speculation was that Jeremy would go back to his constituency and, talk to sort of one or two JVL types there, and they would say, I emphasize, this is speculation, we don't know, but would say, Jeremy, you've really got nothing to apologize for. And Jeremy would sort of say, yeah, I think that's right. And therefore, nothing materialized. So we had this kind of slow, attritional warfare that really crossed the line, I think, really in March of 2018 with the mural, and then of course the enough is enough, and then the attending a politically stupid decision to attend the Judas Passover. I think that offended many people. It was just politically inept, but it was a statement by Jeremy, I think.
John, can I?
Sorry, enough on Jeremy Corbyn.
No. Really interesting on Corbyn, and I'd like to just nail it down a little bit. So, what's your view about him? I assume from what you've already said that your view is that Corbyn does not think of himself as an anti-Semite. He thinks.
Oh, he's genuinely affronted by that. I mean, I think that indignation, that anger, that affront is absolutely genuine.
Right.
And you can understand why it would be genuine, because, his anti-racism has been front and center of his political identity, and the Palestinian cause, of course, has been in many ways. I don't know this is actually true, but I'll throw it out anyway, because if it's not true, it's pretty near true, that the number of, EDMs, that early day motions and so on, that Jeremy has signed up to or proposed about Palestine, about the Palestinian cause, is almost as equals the number of non-Palestinian issues. It's terribly important to Jeremy, and that really was, I think, part of the problem. He just couldn't ever really quite sort of leave his Palestinian comfort zone.
So he thinks of himself. He thinks of himself as being on the left. He thinks of himself as being an opponent of racism and therefore an opponent of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So then Roger Murray or somebody like that comes to him and says,
Andrew Murray.
Is Roger Murray?
Andrew Murray. You were thinking of the
tennis player.
Oh, sorry.
You're right. No.
Who are you thinking of?
I don't know. Anyway, Laura's dad.
Yes, Andrew Murray. Andrew Murray.
No, so comes to him and says, you have to apologise for for the mural and for this and for that and for the other.
Yeah.
And he kind of says, yeah. And then he thinks through what he would have to say, right? And then he goes and talks to some other people who may or may not be JVL types, but anyway, proper, committed, ideological anti-Zionists who say, and they say, no, there's nothing to apologise for, but these allegations are made in bad faith in order to hurt you.
Well, look, I'm only repeating what I was told by people, close to Jeremy. We and even they weren't certain, or at least what they told me. Maybe they did know and didn't want to tell me, but these are people who were in a position to know, if anyone, when we put it like that. And they were puzzled. They said they were puzzled why these various initiatives, didn't materialize. So the assumption was that Jeremy does have some. My understanding is that within his constituency, he does have a number of Jewish friends who, whose advice he takes very seriously, and so the assumption is that he talked to them, ran it past them, and they said, "You've got nothing to apologise for." We don't really know. I can't stand.
No, but there are these two positions.
What I would say, what I think is interesting. I think this is very telling. I do think this is telling. Do you remember around the mural and what led up to, and the mural and there was then this exchange between Jeremy and the Board of Deps, and then the board, and there was a pretty fluent letter from Jeremy, or with his name on it anyway, teasing out the nature of all the nuances, if you like, of contemporary anti-Semitism. The socialism of fools, and how some on the left misunderstood Zionism and so on. These were quite nuanced letters, and I remember thinking, that's interesting. Did Jeremy write that? Because it doesn't, you don't sense that, you don't see that sensitivity in some of the things that Jeremy had said in the past. I mean, he'd say things like, Zionism's the problem, it's all Zionism. So this was a different tone. And of course, it turns out that he didn't write them, as I'm told. I mean, he obviously signed off on them, but he didn't actually draft them. And I was going to say, just for finishing, this is quite, I do find this quite interesting. A week or so after the program in 2019, after Jeremy had clearly lost beyond redemption the trust of the Jewish community, Jeremy, there was quite a good pamphlet set round, he didn't write it, called something like No to Antisemitism, something like that, nothing to do with the program, but it happened to coincide after the program, and it went to all the Labour Party members, and there was a covering note from Jeremy to all 500,000 members saying, I do urge you all to read this. I have learnt so much. I thought that was a terribly telling comment. It was about the only time I thought I imagined myself, Jeremy in his bedroom, looking at a mirror and looking at himself and thinking, maybe there are things I've missed. I don't.
Yeah.
But it was on its face, it was a very revealing comment, because the booklet itself, wasn't bad. Again, it teased out the nuances of contemporary anti-Semitism in a way that Jeremy had never expressed before.
But what it doesn't deal with is the Livingston formulation, is this the counter allegation that the people who are really dealing in bad faith are those who are talking about anti-Semitism, and they're doing it dishonestly, and so in other words, they impute motive.
Yeah.
Right. When they respond by saying it's a scam, and there are some very subtle and nuanced ways of saying this is a scam, they impute motive. They impute bad faith and motive to a whole number of different people at the same time. So they impute conspiracy. So on the one hand, they're kind of close to some understanding of some of the history, and on the other hand, they participate in saying to Jews in the Labour Party, you're lying about this.
Yes, I mean, Jeremy has gone back to his comfort zone in big time, which we can come on to later maybe, but it's true, and there is some of these cases are very instructive. If you take you mentioned Ken Livingstone, and if we focus for a moment on there were two cases in relation to Livingstone. If you remember, there was the first case when he came out with all this nonsense, and it really is historical nonsense. It is, I'm just not repeating sort of stuff like some robot. I mean, the basis for Ken's assertion, that Hitler was supporting Zionism is just so way off track. And of course, Ken, not so widely reported, Ken went much further than that. I mean, he talked about, the Nazis giving Mausers to Jews, and there were sort of joint training camps, and this sort of thing. I mean, it's just, so when the story hit, you remember Jeremy, you may remember, this is maybe for nerds, I'm sorry, but anyway, Jeremy's on a train to Grimsby when the Livingstone story breaks in April of 2016, and what followed I think is very instructive. So Jeremy's on the train to Grimsby, and
did he have a seat?
What?
Did he have a seat?
Does he have a what?
Did he have a seat?
Oh, you're thinking of the Virgin thing, the Virgin Trains thing. I suppose he did, yes. I don't think many people go to Grimsby. I don't know whether anybody's been to Grimsby recently. I have. It's pretty grim. But anyway, sorry, Grimsby. But of course, it's doing a storm with the new fishing liberation on Brexit, but sorry, I mustn't get on to Brexit. So Jeremy's on the train, and in London, the officials are talking to Lotto, Jeremy's office, and MPs are going mad. Sadiq Khan is getting very cross, and the officials say, well, I think he'll need to be suspended. Ken, that is. Now, all I can say is that the Labour Party, I should say, dispute what the account I'm about to give you. But all I can say is that I have seen contemporaneous notes from officials who dealt with Lotto at the time, and what these notes record, I should say, is that Seamus Milne is saying, listen, Ken is very important to Muslims. He's king of the Muslims, and this will send the wrong signal to our Palestinian supporters. I'm paraphrasing, but that is the sense of it. And also that Ken is historically, correct. And there's this kind of back and forth, and Jeremy ends up saying, well, look, if Ken's going to be suspended, then really we need to suspend John Mann as well. There needs to be a sort of an equality of punishment. And Ian McNichol comes in and says, well, we can do that if you like, but if you do that, there'll be a civil war in the Labour Party. And it's only after that reality sort of dawns on Lotto, on Jeremy, I should say, that in the end he reluctantly agrees to suspend Ken, to agree to Ken's suspension. However, fast forward to the he's suspended. He goes before the National Constitutional Committee, and he comes out on the steps and he repeats this nonsense, as you know, and he says, so there's another investigation. Now, on this investigation, shortly before the papers were due to go to the NEC Disputes Committee, part of the formal process, a very senior official gets a call while she's in a Tesco car park from Kerry Murphy, who's Jeremy's chief of staff, and Seamus Milne, and you all know who Seamus Milne is, a senior advisor to Jeremy. And essentially what they say is, look, Ken's coming up for this disciplinary, and Ken's very important to Jeremy. Very important to Jeremy, and he's very important to the left. Is there some way we can get this to go away? That was a direct intervention in a disciplinary case, a very high-profile disciplinary case by the party leader. You'll remember, of course, that there were the denials from Lotto were unequivocal, that Corbyn never ever intervened in cases. And there he was, directly intervening in this. Now, the officials refused, and that was why, in the end, Ken resigned.
So, Don, that's a key issue in your programme, right? That there was political intervention by the leadership to rescue friends of the leadership.
Yeah.
And then it's a key issue in the afters, in the cases.
Yeah.
And it was also a key issue in the Labour Party's defence, the famous 850-page document or whatever it was.
Absolutely, it was, yes. And it was.
Can you just outline the thing about political interference? Because oddly, personally, I would have thought that the leader of the Labour Party should be interfering a little bit in the politics of who's expelled and who isn't, actually.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no. And historically, that has been the case. I don't think people I think most reasonable people would understand that with a high profile politician like Ken Livingstone, you would expect to have some input from the leadership. Although the EHRC, I should say, took a very purist line on this. But I'm making a different point. I mean, the Lotto insisted two things about Ken. Lotto insisted that they never engaged, they never got involved in these cases, anti-Semitism cases, and what I call the revisionists, if you like, which we'll probably come on to, the people who are trying to in my view anyway, trying to rewrite history, and you know, that was part that was always my view, that the reason that particularly Paddy French and for a while the Jewish Voice for Labour were defending, as long as they did for many months, my cases against them, was that they saw the court as an opportunity to demolish a program that was very important to them in order to rehabilitate Jeremy. So this revisionist attempt is, you know, still going strong, although it's whittled down a bit. You know, this Labour, the leaked report that you referred to, the 800-page report, which is a very interesting report for historians, because it does contain a lot of very interesting information, but it's extremely partial. I mean, it is a factional document. It was written by a faction. It's interesting, but it's highly factional, and it just asserts flat out that there's no evidence of interference, and it manifestly is untrue. I mean, there was plenty of evidence of interference, and if you look at if you read, I mean, the revisionists cherry pick from the leaked report. They cherry pick from the EHRC report, and they cherry pick from the latest report by Martin, what's his name? You know, the KC. I mean, they are so selective. In Ford, Martin Ford, I'm sorry, no disrespect to Martin Ford, although a formal letter from the BBC has gone to Martin Ford, to which he hasn't yet replied substantively, because he got something completely round his neck, absolutely round his neck about Panorama. I mean, really awful, actually, appalling. Anyway, my point is that these are the revisionists take what they want from it. So with the leaked report, for example, they say there was no interference. They blame pretty much the Panorama whistleblowers and other officials for the anti-Semitism crisis. They acknowledge that, but whilst at the same time saying that looking at the leadership was, quotes, beyond the scope of this report. But it was. Of course it was. And then when you get to the EHRC, their position on interference there is that they interpret the EHRC report as saying, well, to the extent that there was interference, it was benign. It was in order to catalyze actions, anti-Semitism cases. There is nothing in the EHRC report that says the principle that most of the cases were of interference were about catalyzing them. Nothing at all about that. It does say that in some cases that was the case, but in my view, the evidence that the interference was in relation to principally Jeremy's political allies is extremely strong.
So the big picture response in the 150-page document is not only that there was no anti-Semitism, and therefore the anti-Semitism was invented by the opponents of Corbyn in order to hurt Corbyn and to hurt the left, but also that the people responsible for the inability of the system to pick up what anti-Semitism there was goes to the right faction, which was messing up the system and making it inefficient in order to hurt Corbyn. So both, there was no anti-Semitism that was made up by the left, but by the Zionists, but also there was anti-Semitism, and Jeremy would have fixed it if it hadn't been for those meddling right-wingers.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. The leak report. It's a curious beast. If you read Martin Ford, as you say, David, it is 858 pages long. And if you read Martin Ford, it looks from the Ford report. The Ford report, if you remember, was an investigation into the leak report and its findings. And my reading of the Ford report is that the last 400 pages, Ford does say the last 400 pages or so were written in great haste. I mean, in a week or two, towards the end of March, beginning of April, the report was leaked in April. Well, I mean, anyone who's dealt with evidence, particularly forensically, by which I mean where words really matter. Do we really mean this? Do we really mean that? Can we stand over this? Can we stand over that? You can't you can't fact check 400 pages you can, let alone write 400 pages, but fact check it within a couple of weeks. And there are a number of internal inconsistencies statistically. Some of the claims they make about the failure of officials under Ian McNicol to deal with anti-Semitism cases are internally inconsistent. That is not to say there wasn't a problem. I mean, there was a problem. There was clearly manifestly a big problem in dealing with the tsunami of complaints. But the fact of the matter is that no system could have dealt with that increase. And again, it's very important. This Ford, it's a figure I never came across. Ford says that by the end of 2016, there was something like 1,500 or so complaints. There were 5,000 complaints, almost a third of which related to anti-Semitism. Well, that was just in Jeremy's first year.
Yeah,
but they grew and they grew and they grew. They had 3 people investigating these complaints.
Yeah. So the focus on complaints and their investigation was already a mismatch with the problem, which was political anti-Semitism. So they understood political anti-Semitism to mean finding the bad people with anti-Semitism in their souls and putting them through a quasi-judicial process and kicking them out. But it never was that anyway. John, let me ask you another question. So that was also the response to the Panorama, right? Which is the same as the 850-word document. The response to Panorama was, firstly, it's all lies, it's a scam, there was no anti-Semitism. And therefore, the people who made the programme are not real journalists, are not honest, are liars and despicable people. And secondly, also that there was anti-Semitism, but it was not properly investigated by the right, and the right put a spanner in the works and sabotaged the system of investigation.
Yes, that's pretty much it. There were clearly failings, significant failings in those early months in the under Ian McNicol. These failings continued, I should say, some of them under Jenny Formby. But I would say this is not recognized by the revisionists, and it's a fact that several of the key reforms that Jenny Formby benefited from, about how to get a grip on this tsunami, this chaos, so it's several reforms, software programs, smaller panels dealing with anti-Semitism cases so they could meet more regularly. And so these are all, most of these were inspired, many of them were inspired under the Nicol regime and came and bore fruit because they took time to bed in under Formby, and Formby takes the credit for that with no recognition. The genesis of these ideas and reforms was under McNichol, and you know, anyway. So just a word on the scale, because essentially the allegation, the thing that really the as I keep calling them, the revisionists came at me for was scale. Scale's terribly important to them. They have to acknowledge there was a problem. The argument is over the scale of the problem. They have a particular problem with scale because, notwithstanding the fact that they gave Jeremy a free pass, the leak report made it clear in no uncertain terms that there was a serious problem. And I agree with that. I mean, it was clear to me when I read several hundred pages of this particular document that I was given access to, which has never been published. It was very clear to me that there was a problem. And when I say problem, I want to define what I mean by that. Obviously, there was the obvious stuff, you know, Rothschild runs the world, you know, Israelis are fascists, the IDF are Nazis, all that sort of tendentious, offensive nonsense. There was all that, but an awful lot of this, if not most of it, was the feeling. It was quite clear from the statements that I read and the branch motions, in, you know, that essentially there was an atmosphere sort of leaching into the Labour Party that unless, if you were Jewish, unless you know, wore your anti-Zionism on your sleeve, you were kind of, you know, you might not be tolerated. You know, there was something wrong, and that was just horrible.
Yeah,
and of course it was ludicrous as well, because I mean the vast majority of Jewish members of the Labour Party, you know, were pretty hostile to you know, Israeli governments, particularly the Netanyahu government, but they weren't going to give ground on the fundamental principle of self-determination and Zionism, clearly. And you know, that was the really insidious thing. And yeah.
Sorry, so that's it, right? The allegation of bad faith, the allegation that this is being brought up in bad faith in order to hurt us, and to hurt our shared community, and therefore you are treacherous to our shared community. And that's why there was such a personal response towards you, because the response towards you had to be, you know, not John Ware isn't a very good journalist, or not that John Ware is, you know, has his own politics and was queening it up a bit, but it has to be John Ware has made this all up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is why I said, right, well, I'm going to give you a fight, because
and you know, by the way, sorry, not only has he made this all up, but because
I said really, it's worse than that, David. I set out to. You know, this is a big plot. You know, I you know, was some sort of, I mean, they didn't say this, but I have been accused. Anyway, so I set out to mislead. I deliberately set out to mislead. So I knew X was true, but hey, I disseminated.
But and we know why. The reason is because you're far right, according to whoever it was, right? So that. Okay, so in a sense then...
on my shelf here, I've got a prize from Amnesty for a human right, you know.
Yeah. So in a sense then, the abuse that came to you was an ideal type of the abuse that came to everyone who raises the issue of anti-Semitism in academia, in the party, anywhere. So you decided to take them to court, to say, no, this is libelous, and I'm not having it.
Yeah, because I try, it didn't matter how many statements we put out and contradiction, how we contradicted it. It was just like talking to a wall. So as far as I was concerned, I thought, right, we'll have this from a judge. I'll take my chances with a judge. And judges are independent. They have pretty good reputation for being dispassionate and all that. I mean, even Paddy French said, I want it settled in the forensic setting of a court. I couldn't agree more. The difference is that he bottled it. I didn't, he did.
And how does it feel? I mean, you're paying whatever hundreds of pounds an hour for lawyers. You're spending days and weeks and months and years doing research. You take on the risk. If you lose and you have costs fined against you, you risk your house. How is it? How are you?
Well, as they say, that so. I think it was an American. I think it was in a member of the Supreme Court. It was a phrase that kept ringing round my head. Anyway, only a fool litigates, and I've got us, and it had its moments, I must say, but the problem in my case, the problem has not been losing because I've won every one. The problem has been winning because I've now, I am liable for my costs if I can't get them back from Mr. French.
So you did say you had, the judge gave you more money than you asked for, but you still don't have enough money to pay for your legal.
No, well, I won't get it. I mean, it's all very well. It's all very well being awarded this stuff. It doesn't mean anything unless it gets paid. And there's no sign at the moment. I mean, a cost order has already been sent to this individual for an interim cost order for, I think, 300,000 or something. But not a penny has arrived yet, and I'm not sure it ever will. That's what's worrying me at the moment. And of course, I'm liable for if it isn't, I'm liable for this. I'm not a rich man.
Yep.
Sorry,
the anti-Zionists and their crowdfunding.
Yeah.
Is it effective? Do they raise serious amounts of money doing that?
The French didn't raise that much. He raised about 90, 100,000, something like that, which is doesn't go far in these cases, although it's a decent sum. But it wouldn't have got him. He said he's had to pay most of that to his lawyers, which is kind of interesting because at one stage his lawyers said to us that his lawyers, Bindman's, and of course Sir Geoffrey Bindman was publicly opposed to the programme when it was nominated for BAFTA. He came out, I think I'm right in saying, opposed the nomination with Ken Loach and various others. So I don't know exactly what's gone on between French and Bindman's. I mean, that's between them.
So, John, one more big question for you, I think, and I'd like to give people an opportunity to come and ask some questions too. So tell us exactly the results so far of the cases. What has happened?
Yeah, well, it's not going well for the Corbynites. That's a good bit of news, I guess. I'm not the only one who's litigated, of course. Rachel Riley has, and various others have, and I may not be up to. When last I looked, there were 20-something cases arising from the Corbyn years. Most of those related to defamation, but not all. One or two are, what do you call it? DPA, Data Protection Act. But of those 20 odd, I think the win rate from our side, if you like, is 70+%. And my estimate of the costs of to Corbynites so far is getting on for about 6 million. So look, what it comes down to, David, is really this. What was different about this is that these people, gave themselves the right to attribute the most, malign motives to people who, promoted, if you like, or argued a political orthodoxy which grossly offended them, and they felt they had their reflex to that was just to say, well, we don't, not just that we disagree with you, but that you, as you say, you must be a bad person. You must have been dishonest. You must have lied. You must have set out to mislead. And that's not only wrong, it's very stupid. And it's incredibly stupid. And what's especially stupid in my case is that it's the most basic. All of the people that I sued had all got journalistic backgrounds. The people who wrote the defamatory statements for the Labour Party press release, where they accused me of inventing things and all that. I mean, they had long experience at journalism, some of those people. Naomi Wimborne-Idrisi, I was intrigued to discover in her litigation with me, had been a Reuters journalist, so she said, for something like 20 years. Now, Reuters is a very respectable news agency, as you know. So I was amazed to, I was rather surprised to see that she simply come up. And then, of course, Paddy French, who described himself as a very experienced investigative journalist. So all these people were journalists, and yet they committed the most basic error of all.
But, I mean, it might be kind of stupid, but actually there's no other way for them to deal with it, right? That anti-Semites make allegations against Jews, and they cannot substantiate them, so they then have to say that they are made in bad faith.
No, I mean they think. I mean, it's a given that they've established them. I mean, in their heads, it's just a fact. It's a given. And so the next phase is to blacken the character of the author, and that's what they did. And it's and so if I've put a price on if I've put a price on people not connecting their brains with their mouths, then I'm a happy guy. That's good.
Okay, I would like to take some questions. I know that there's been quite a lot of talking in the chat, but there's much too much for me to get my head around. So I will ask people to indicate and to ask short, sharp questions, to say short, sharp things with their voices and their faces, and I would be very happy to start with Rashad, who has his hand up. I think, Rash, are you there? Hey, mute.
Is that Rashad Ali? Is that my friend Rashad?
Yes, that is your friend Rashad Ali, who is muted. Rash, you're muted.
Sorry, my apologies. Old man here. I think it's really interesting. I think your very forensic approach is very, very gracious. So I think what you apply is a lot of bandwidth, if that makes sense, to a lot of what they're doing. And just anecdotally, going back to the first time I wrote about Jeremy Corbyn was like 2010. And it was when he had brought Raed Salah over from
Israel
over to the UK.
Yeah.
And this was a well-established, not just anti-Semite in the sense of someone who believed in the old Christian libel, the blood libel, and it documented and proselytized this.
Yeah.
But was someone who had actively raised money for terrorist groups to kill Jews. So I think the nature of his anti-Semitism is a little bit, in my opinion, I think it's a little bit more profound.
The nature of Jeremy's alleged anti-Semitism, is that what you mean?
Yes, I think it's a little bit more profound, I think, in my view. And I think this kind of came, and also the people around him, because when I wrote this piece, I was attacked by The Guardian And I normally in that scenario you have a right to reply. And so I was also someone known to the Guardian, so I contacted the Guardian. I wrote a response. They made me substantiate every single claim that I made.
All right.
And then afterwards they refused to publish it.
Really?
And that was Seamus
Well,
Milne.
that's very interesting. Look, I don't want to get into whether I've never.
The point I was going to make just was that was Seamus Milne. So there's a group of people that have a culture and a set of ideas about this stuff, and it's not about them as all anti-racists will tell you. It's not about the individual.
Well, look,
the system and the belief system.
Well, look,
and I think that's what they buy into, which is it's an inherent part of that worldview. And they're blind to it. It's very much like a cognitive dissonance that they can't see that they have embraced a belief system. The only type of anti-Semitism they can see is Jews are vermin. That's what anti-Semitism is. It's the kind of fascistic anti-Semitism. It's not the conspiracism. Well, it's not the
no. You absolutely. Look. I mean, so in Labour's tediously long 43 pages, I think it was, response to my right of reply letters, on and on and on it went. They listed all of Jeremy's attacks on swastikas on synagogues and all that sort of thing. We heard again, I think, about his mother at Cable Street and so on. So all of that's a given. I mean, Jeremy would be on the barricades with you or me against skinhead Doc Martin tattooed boot boys yelling obscenities at Jews. He'd be there on the barricades, no question. But that, as you rightly say, that wasn't the version we were looking at. And I look, I mean, I have always avoided, and I will tonight too. I've avoided saying whether I think Jeremy is an anti-Semite or not, because I honestly don't know, and I think it's a terribly serious allegation. I don't particularly, I haven't looked into the man's soul, and I don't know what goes on there. But and as a libel lawyer once gave me the best advice ever. He said, why don't you just report the facts? And it's a jolly good discipline if you think about it. What I would say in relation to Jeremy and Raed Salah, because it is a good case, Rash, you've unmuted yourself, Rash. Yes, it's all right. You've muted yourself. I don't know whether you can hear me now. I've lost your picture, but
I can hear you. I just thought I don't want to.
No, sure. No, it's a good case. I mean, I think it's a very good case. So, what are the facts with Jeremy's knowledge of Raed Salah? The facts are that if Jeremy hadn't known in advance of Salah's arrival at Heathrow about the allegations of anti-Semitism against him, he pretty soon will have read them, because they were in most newspapers set out in detail. All right, they were allegations. Let's give Jeremy the benefit of the doubt. He was saying, well, they're allegations, they're not proved. Fair enough. So then we go to the Immigration Tribunal, and there were two hearings. Sorry if this is a bit nerdy, but I'm afraid the devil is in the detail with these things, and it really matters. So there are two hearings, and the lower chamber and the upper chamber of the Immigration Tribunal. And the upper chamber finds as a fact that Salah's justification for the words he used in a speech in Jerusalem, allegedly inciting a crowd, did amount to him having invoked the blood libel, and in fact the judges found that his explanations were wholly true and not credible, and all the rest of it. Now, as a matter of fact, the judges found in favor on Salah on a number of other points, but on the blood libel, they were unequivocal. Now, that judgment came out I've forgotten the date now. I can't. I mean, sort of sometime in mid-April, early mid-April, 2000 and something. And Jeremy appeared on a platform with Salah's lawyer some days later. Now, it's possible Jeremy hadn't read the judgment, although the press conference was to celebrate the fact that the judges, despite having found that Salah had invoked the blood libel, didn't think actually he was a threat to public order and allowed him to stay. So they were celebrating his victory, but within that judgment was an absolute.
I think as well, there was a technicality about he was arrested without his rights being read to him.
That stuff, whatever. But the point is, within the judgment was an unequivocal finding of fact that he'd invoked the blood libel. Now, you know, I mean, you would hope that Jeremy would have read that judgment, because that was the purpose of the press conference. But I can't definitively prove that Jeremy didn't read that. Maybe he didn't read that passage. Maybe it's a question of, you know, I don't look for what I don't want to read. I don't know. But it's very odd that that he you know, is that he associates with Salah, invites him to tea and all the rest of it, despite the fact that there is a judgment from a British court about this hideous invocation of the blood libel. It's astonishing. I think it's astonishing. And when Jeremy is pressed on it, he just says, well, he didn't say that to me.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, Jeremy knows about that because he knows he's in court and he knows the CST are providing evidence.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jude and to Alan. There is in the chat a very long and involved question, which is forensically putting some of the questions that have been put to you by, I think from Al Jazeera, which I will ask you about. But first, let's go to Jude and to Alan. Sharp and brief. Thank you.
Very short. First of all, I want to say, John, thank you for everything you do. I don't think you realise the support that.
Oh,
I think you've unmuted yourself. You've muted yourself, I think, Jude.
I think that was my fault. I apologise.
Shall I unmute? I can't unmute it.
Wait.
I'm unmuted now. It was David's fault. So just, you know,
Sorry,
just very quickly, thank you. You know, there's huge amounts of support for you. I'm very interested, two very quick things. The BBC support from fellow high profile reporters. Have they been supported privately? Have they been supported publicly? I've not seen anything. So that's one thing. And we need to make sure you get your libel money because you deserve it.
Well, look, let me say that it's Ruth, wonderful Ruth Deach. Is she listening here? Ruth, of course, as she is as a former governor, so she knows how the BBC works. The BBC on this case have been absolutely solid as a rock. Honestly, you know, they commissioned the program. I mean, okay, I had to work quite hard to get the program commissioned, but they commissioned it, and they've stood by me solidly. They you know, they haven't funded me to. I mean, it wasn't there. I mean, quite rightly, they haven't funded me. You can't use public money for you know, for plaintiffs. I mean, it exists only to defend their own staff against lawsuits. So I can't fault them for not funding me. It was my my choice to take the action. So no one should blame them for that. But privately, they've been extremely supportive, and I wouldn't fault them. And the Director General, Tony Hall, was solid as a rock. And I would say this about the BBC, because I know the BBC at the moment, the Jewish Chronicle have got some sort of parliamentary campaign inquiry against the BBC, which I don't altogether agree with. That said, clearly there have been problems. There are problems within the BBC. It's a very large organization. There's a problem in the Arabic service. Absolutely. It's a very balkanized organization, actually. So there's good and bad parts. But anyway, I've made quite a number of programs at the BBC, where the BBC have taken a risk in relation to extremism and anti-Semitism and so on. So, I'm not going to. They've been very supportive, is all I can say. I know that.
I was actually really thinking about the high-profile reporters like your peers.
I see. Well, I don't know.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, it's a good question. I imagine some will have gone, but I don't know that. Certainly, my colleagues on Panorama have been 100%, 110%.
Okay.
Yep.
Alan, and then Chris, if you want to also. Alan, what's your question or comment?
Well, thanks, David. Well, Jude's largely taken both of my points. First of all, big thank you, John, for everything you do on our behalf. We often feel a bit beleaguered. It's great to know there's people like you fighting on our team, as it were. My question really was about the BBC, and I think it's a general feeling that amongst myself and other members of the community, that the BBC is not, how can I put this, not sympathetic to the Jewish, the Israel side. There's a bias there. Yet they, as you said, they backed you, they showed your program. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, which I think you've probably largely answered already.
Well, hang on a sec, John. Let me just go to Chris. Do you want to ask a question, Chris, or not? Unmute.
So my question is, having studied media and having been exposed to the kind of, I don't want to say left-wing bias, more far left bias at university, what would you say to young media professionals who are afraid to be open about their pro-Israel beliefs or their Zionist beliefs, fear of being blacklisted?
Well, I would always say you've got to stand up for your beliefs, but you've got to work out what they are, and you've got to be clear and confident about them, and you've got to anticipate, what the other side are going to hurl at you, and you've got to, because this is high octane stuff, and it is a complicated dispute, conflict. It's not a simple conflict. One side treats it as a sort of morality play, which is what I find so wearying, really. But clearly, there are wrongs on the Israeli side. I mean, I think most people would recognise that, and there clearly are. But the fundamental principle of self-determination and the importance of the survival of a democratic Jewish state is for me is a given. It always has been, always will be. So there's an awful lot of ignorance, isn't there? I mean, the fact that this Labour MP, what's her name, Kim Johnson, in the House of Commons today, said a very stupid thing and then had to retract it, shows you that I mean, I don't know where she's been for the last 6 years, this MP, but I mean, she's obviously not a fast learner, is she? It is entirely possible to be trenchantly critical of an Israeli government without resorting to grotesquely offensive words like fascist and really sort of stupid comments like apartheid. I mean, clearly, the within the green line, the idea that Israel is an apartheid state is preposterous. It is. You could certainly make a credible argument that if you want to include the West Bank and so on, it's inching to it. That there are circumstances in which it could inch towards something resembling that, but I would say nothing like on the scale as apartheid in South Africa, but you know, you can make a case. So my own view is that I just wish people would be a bit more thoughtful about the criticism instead of knee-jerking. And but as to the BBC, I mean, look, the BBC's role on what kicked this off was the Oxford Street assault, wasn't it, on the Habads? And the BBC dug in on that. The trouble is the BBC does have a habit of digging in, apologizing when it's sort of when all the damage is done and it's too late. That's what they did on Bashir, on the Princess Di Bashir thing, and that's what they've done on the Oxford Street incident. It's regrettable because it was so obviously wrong. I still don't think that, and you know, as I say, that the Arabic service has had, as long as I can remember, there have been incidents, and I don't quite know why they persist, but they do, and they have, and that's a problem. But I think personally, I mean, you may disagree, I think personally the reporting of the conflict, by and large these days, is pretty fair. It's a hell of a lot better than it was during the Second Intifada, I think. There are serious questions the Israeli government have to answer at the moment, particularly at the moment. Not to say it makes it a lot harder for some of us to fight their corner sometimes.
John, I want to ask you a question from somebody called John Spencer Davis, who I think isn't wanting to ask it himself. He's asking the questions about the parts of the documentary which dealt with Izzy Langer's when she said that she's been subjected to anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and then there seems to have been some confusion about exactly who she was talking to, and he's also cross-examining about the Ben Westerman issue. Perhaps briefly you might outline the issue that's being raised by a number of people there, and explain whether or not there were mistakes made in the programme and whether you're responsible, and how those have been raised by Al Jazeera and others.
And this is someone who doesn't want to answer the question himself?
This is John Spencer Davis, who says he's busy reading the Jewish news and therefore doesn't have time to ask his own question.
Well, if he's reading the Jewish news, it's all set out in the Jewish news. So I'm slightly curious why he's answering. I mean, I gave pretty lengthy responses to both those points in the Jewish news, and all he needs to do is look them up.
Fine. Ruth, I'm sure that I should be using some correct title, but it will be Ruth Deach.
I love the BBC. I was a governor, as John said, and I think John's programme is one of the highlights, if not the best ever part of the BBC reporting on Jewish matters. However, the BBC is a good example of how many people managed to divide anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel. I think the BBC, as John says, will stand up and promote the integrity of its reporters, and is absolutely against what they would call racism. But when it comes to Israel coverage, I am more troubled, I think, than John is. It goes back a long way. When I was a governor, it was the time of the Lebanon War, and I presented the governors with 17 misleading incidents that I'd seen or heard myself, not that others had told me about, totally documented. And every single one except one was rejected. there's a sort of defensive element, as you said, about handling complaints. And my own view, which I've pushed for a long time, is that Ofcom will not do as the ultimate handler of complaints, A, because they're no more expert than the BBC, and B, because Ofcom is full of former BBC and TV employees. It's a sort of retirement home for them, and they share the same attitude. My own view is that there should be an independent ombudsman who could call on expert evidence. Because when there's a discussion about the status of the wall or the status of the Temple Mount or something, you need experts to inform you. You can't just say to a bunch of governors, or Ofcom people, you decide it. I am sitting on this committee, totally informal one, which is going to look into the BBC coverage of Jewish matters. I was very rankled recently by the reporting on David Miller, the man who was ultimately sacked from Bristol, because the BBC reported it as David Miller sacked for talking about Israel. And I thought that was such a misleading headline. Sure. It made it look as though you got sacked just for talking about Israel. And in fact, it was a horrible conspiracy attitude that he had, and he was misbehaving towards his students. And that complaint got turned down. And then, of course, there was the Oxford Street affair. And there was the business of one of their regular correspondents, well, he used to be, talking about Salman Rushdie when Salman Rushdie was attacked and saying, oh, you've got to understand the Arab point of view. He was very insulting. And I thought that was bad. So we will look at the BBC. The question I'd like to ask John is, where does this anti-Semitism, that's right, Abdul Bari outline, where does it come from? With all the education that kids get at school now, Holocaust education, and the bee in my own bonnet, Holocaust memorials, so many you can't even count them, where is it coming from? Both on the left and the extreme right, I understand, perhaps. Well, no, I'm not sure I do, but the extreme left and the extreme right. And even the middle of the road. I met a woman the other day, a Cambridge graduate, said, well, of course there's anti-Semitism. Look how they're behaving in Israel. Oh dear,
Yeah. Gosh, well, where does it come from? It's in the soil, I think, as one despairing colleague told me when I asked the same question, because I was saying, well, it's been part of English literature for almost 1,000 years. No, well, getting on for that. It is rarely, if ever, addressed in any school curriculum, which I think is a major problem, and I think it needs to be. There have been attempts. I know I know of attempts to go into individual schools and to educate kids on this, and some teachers are very welcoming, but others were not, and one or two were even hostile. It's an enormous problem. But I think, and a lot of it, of course, is wrapped up with Israel. And I think what I'm about to say, a lot of people will find very controversial, but I can only speak as I speaking personally. So insofar as it relates to Israel, which is the source of a lot of contemporary anti-Semitism, but it's by no means the exclusive source, of course. I think on Israel, you're either someone who looks at the history of the Jewish people and looks and is just really so admiring of the tenacity and the story of survival. Really, it is a remarkable story. The the creation of Israel is a remarkable story in its own right, and what it has achieved. None of this, of course, ignores the people who lost out, principally the Palestinians. But you either admire, it's either something you celebrate as an example of human, of courage and of ambition, of tenacity, of it's something you either it becomes a sort of light unto nations, if you like, and so you admire it with all the caveats that we all know about, historical caveats, and some of them make grim reading, but it's either something as a story of human survival that you admire, or it's something you get cranked by. And if you're cranked by it, sort of thinking it's not fair, it's not fair, it's not fair, then I think my own view is that you sort of likely to find yourself more disposed to anti-Semitic sentiments. But if it's something that you fundamentally admire, then I think you find it very perplexing, and I'm on that side. I always have been. Just how I see the situation. I speak as someone who isn't Jewish, by the way, of course. So that's anti-Semitism in relation to Israel. As to the more deeply ingrained and historical version, it's just it's a mystery.
I would just point out anti-Semitism goes back thousands of years, long before the creation of Israel.
I know, but in terms of England, it's been around for 1,000 years. It's been a major part of English literature, and I it isn't explained in it's not part of the curriculum, I don't think yet, is it? It's not really. I think it is in Middle East studies it does, but I doubt I don't know what the curriculum, but I doubt it deals with it in any sort of really thoughtful and scholarly way. And I think kids are pretty sensible people. If you spell out how deeply irrational and stupid it is, you might start to build a generation of kids who say, sorry, that's just stupid. What are you talking about? It's just stupid. But we don't have enough of that. It's just stupid. What are you talking about? What do you mean Jews are good with money? What are you talking about? Lots of people are good with money. But as I say, my despairing colleague says you'll never beat it. It's in the soil, and that's the really depressing story. So I don't have an answer, Ruth. I'm sorry.
John, thank you. I think we're moving towards the end. If somebody's keen to get a question in, if John Spencer Davis, who is still pushing on the Westerman issue, would like to speak, then I'd be very happy to hear from him. Go on, John.
I was going to say, I wonder why.
I think he's read Jewish News and he's come back with with some more, but he in a kind of variant of green ink, he's got a very flickery screen, so I don't know. Right. Rash, would you like to have a quick second bite at your cherry?
I'm sorry, are you speaking with me?
Rash, you have your hand up, right? Oh, John Spencer Davis. John, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Ware. I much appreciate the programme. Yeah, given the discrepancy between Mr. Westerman and Ms. Bird, do you think it would be reasonable for a correction or clarification to be put out to the programme?
No, I don't, because have you read the Jewish news? It's a you have to the devil is in the detail. I don't know whether you've read the Jewish news. Have you?
I've just read the article. Thank you.
Right. So you will have read that the Al Jazeera version of events is that the tape is definitive. I don't know whether people are.
That's what they say.
Yeah, that's what they say. But you see,
Sure
the trouble is the tape isn't definitive, because Mr. Westerman's evidence is that the question came right at the end as he was leaving, and all I can say is that Rika Bird had persisted, I think on a couple of occasions at least, in wondering which branch Ben Westerman came from. Now, she says, and Al Jazeera said, that was just a comradely question. Well, maybe it was, but it's a strange question to persist with. And it would not be illogical for the final question when Westerman said, look, I don't think it's relevant. Westerman, of course, being Jewish himself.
As I believe is Rika Bird.
Sorry?
As I believe is Rika Bird.
As indeed Rika Bird and Helen Marks, and both of them, I think, are members of the JVL. I think I'm right in saying. For them to say, are you from Israel? Now, I'm not, I wasn't present, so I can't say definitively that that was said, but that was Westerman's evidence, and he reported it when he got back to London, as it was confirmed to me, and the tape does cut out abruptly. I don't know whether you've heard the tape. Have you heard the tape?
Yes, I have. Thank you. Yes.
You have, and you'll know that it suddenly just cuts out.
John, I wonder if you could quickly.
I mean, I don't. This is kind of.
Sorry, I meant the other John.
Yeah.
John Spencer Davis, could you quickly explain to us why everybody should be really, really interested in this particular issue that you're raising?
I'm not sure whether anybody should be. I myself am interested.
Yeah, why?
And you did invite me to ask.
Yeah, I'm just asking you to explain the issue and why it's really important.
Well, because unless let's assume that Mr. Westerman's evidence is mistaken. It may not be, it may be, but at the lowest, the Jewish News says that he might be mistaken. Considering the impact that the programme had, is it not reasonable to point out that a mistake may have been made in it?
So is it your view that?
No, I don't think it is, John, because I mean, I wasn't aware of the tape when Westerman. I had absolutely no reason not to believe Mr. Westerman. I thought he was a very credible witness. There is, in my view, very little dispute about the fact of anti-Semitism being present in the Riverside CLP. Now, Rika Bird and Helen Marks would dispute that, but I respectfully disagree. I've seen very credible evidence and heard credible evidence of anti-Semitic comments associating Israel with in sort of some collusive relationship with ISIS, which is, I think, frankly ridiculous, for example. But I mean, of course, I can't definitively say that Westerman hasn't convinced himself that something like that was said when it wasn't, because I wasn't present. But by the same token, what Al Jazeera and what I would describe as the revisionists cannot say, as they have done, that the BBC told an, quote, outright lie. An outright lie means, the meaning of outright lie means that we knew something was true but said something else. That is a ludicrous allegation. There is no evidence for that at all. I would never, in a month, I mean, it's never even, I've never even, you know, the idea that I would stand over something like that is nonsense. And I don't.
Do you mind if I ask, Mr. Ware? Did you?
Is that
did
John?
you
Is
ask
that the
Mr.
significance?
Westerman?
Is that the significance of your question, that you think that you've uncovered one lie, and therefore it puts the whole of the documentary into doubt? Is that what you think you've discovered?
Those are your words, not mine.
Well,
That's a
What I
question.
would ask Mr. Ware is,
It's a question.
do you know, Mr. Ware, did you know at the time which interview Mr. Westerman was referring to?
No, because he couldn't remember.
Because he couldn't remember.
No, he interviewed quite a lot of people.
Did you seek any confirmation of it?
To the extent that his colleagues said they recalled him describing the event, yes, but I didn't. I mean, I had no reason to. Why would I disbelieve him? I mean, I had no reason to disbelieve him, and I still don't disbelieve him necessarily either. By the way, so I'm not quite sure. What's the point you're getting at?
Presumably part of
Working quite hard here, aren't you, to try? I mean, are you sort of, are you sure you're, you know?
part of your job, presumably as a journalist, is to corroborate stories, right?
Sure, but I had no reason to disbelieve Westerman. He didn't know the names of the people, and as I say to you, I'm not entirely convinced that he's not right anyway.
Okay, thanks very much, John. I'd like to move.
He didn't actually.
To,
I mean, sorry.
Sorry, I'd like to move to Rashad and to Alex Hearn.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on a point that I think has been made in the chat, but I think it is quite important. If you step out and you say to anybody, I don't like Muslims because of 9/11 and 7/7, you know, the gut reaction to that is, that's a very prejudicial viewpoint. You are judging an entire group of people by a specific action. You are assuming a set of values by everybody shared, etc., etc. Or I see lots of crime, ergo I'm going to judge certain types of classes and cultures and peoples, etc. These are common stereotypes that people use, which we rightly call racist tropes. And I think the idea that the assumption of, oh, of course we're going to have anti-Semitism increasing because Israel does X, Y, Z, that logic should be seen in exactly the same way. That a specific action is generalized, that generalization takes place about Israel as a whole, and then that's applied to all Jews. So the fact that it's not, even though it's a very, very simple and obvious logic, is the blind side that the left has always had towards anti-Semitism. And there's a certain set of precepts as to why. Israel is an existent state. As soon as it was a state that was seen as a more powerful state than its surrounding neighbors, supported by the West, it fits an ideological set of beliefs about anti-imperialism, about Western hegemony, about Western allies. It's the same reason why we find on the left, and I say this as someone who broadly aligns myself with the left, there's a blind side towards the Iranian regime whilst criticizing the Saudis. And I'm not saying the Saudis are angelic. Saudis obviously have horrendous human rights records, and their capital punishment for people, you know, engaging in criticizing the regime, whether it's drug smuggling, etc. But Iran has a higher per capita capital punishment, you know, than the Saudis. So if it was based on principle, then that would be equally, if not more so, the case. It's not. It's based on ideology, and it's that same ideological take that people cannot see that they're blinded to this kind of anti-Semitism. And it's very hard for people because of that ideological take, but it's not impossible. It just requires a moment's reflection and intellectual integrity. And I think this is what's essentially lacking within that kind of cognitive dissonance, that this conflicts with my ideological belief, therefore I'm just going to park it. And that's what you saw repeatedly with these people. And I think that's what you see, frankly, with someone taking a documentary from Al Jazeera, where they accuse people who gave speeches criticizing people for being Islamophobic and attacking the far right as being defenders of the far right because they attended an event to debate the far right. It was a shoddy, awful piece of pseudo-journalistic propaganda, and it shouldn't be seen in the same light as a normal investigative inquiry, and we should treat it as such. Sorry,
John, before you answer that, I want to let Alex come in, please.
Thanks
Alex,
very much. Actually,
by the way, Alex is the hero who built our website for us.
Right.
So thank you, Alex.
Thanks. So it's almost a continuation of Rashad's point, and that is just to start off with the impact that your program had. It was tremendous. It gave everyone a voice who had been saying these things, and it laid it out very forensically to the wider public. And it was incredibly important to do that, to give a voice. And then the backlash, which involves this very conspiratorial type approach, where you hone in on a very specific detail to try and undermine the whole thing and try and create a narrative, a pattern, if you like, out of that. This backlash has been very vocal, but very small, and it hasn't even made the smallest dent into Panorama. No one in the wider public is talking about Ben Westerman. No one in the wider public is talking about the Labour files. People saw your Panorama programme and they took it in, and that's the end of it. So really, you must be, in a way, and this is my question, a little bit pleased that people have grown so desperate that they have actually crossed the line in some way.
It's not as simple as that, actually, Alex. I thank you for those reassuring words, but I have to say that I do keep abreast of even though you're right, it's dribbled off. It's still there if you look for it, there are some individuals who just won't let go, who are utterly seamless, and it is quite frustrating, but actually it's not a healthy place to be. I mean, I've spent most of the last 3 years certainly the last year has been dominated by litigation. I've hardly been able to do any work at all. I had to give up on this book because every time I got my mojo, it would be taken away from me by lawyers' questions. But it is deeply frustrating still to see these things. And there's another performance next week, I think, called The Big Lie. That the dramatis personae tend now to be very predictably the same. They tend to be, Chris Williamson, Jackie Walker, Ken Loach, Alexei Sale, sometimes a starring role by Jeremy himself.
Andrew Murray, I think, in this one.
Yes, oddly, Andrew Murray. I've got quite a lot of time for Andrew, as a matter of fact. I did have a number of conversations with him, and it was clear to me that he did understand contemporary anti-Semitism in a way that people might not have understood that he did, as a matter of fact. So that was quite an eye-opener, and he was a deeply thoughtful man. I mean, I'm not on the same page ideologically with him, but he was a civilized guy who was very thoughtful, and I am surprised.
Does that make it worse, John, if he understands it and still?
Well, it depends what you do with that understanding, doesn't it? And I think I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but I think Andrew would say that he was one of those who did try to encourage Jeremy to say and do the right thing. that would I mean, his concern was, you know, they were losing sight of the project, obviously. You know, the same with the Shadow Chancellor. I mean, they were deeply frustrated that Jeremy just couldn't kick this problem out, you know, dispose of it so they could get on with the main event. But I do think in Andrew's case there was a genuine concern about it. Actually, that's my own personal view as it happened. You can only speak as
I would like very quickly to see Jonathan Turner, and then there will be the last question and the last response from John Ware. Jonathan.
Oh, Jonathan.
You're muted, Jonathan. You're still muted, Jonathan.
You're muted, Jonathan. Hello,
John, a different type of question. As an experienced user of the court system, do you have any suggestions as to how it could be improved?
Well, no, I think on defamation, I think it's, I mean, a lot of people don't agree with this, but I think it's a lot better than it was. I think the meaning stage, where you have to establish whether the meaning of actually what was said, the two-stage process before you go to trial, if you go to trial, is the right thing. I much prefer a judge deciding these things than a jury, personally. I mean, what can I say? Lawyers are very creative people, Jonathan, as you know, and you know, they have a way of making life really difficult for you, and Bindman certainly tried to make life really difficult for me, really difficult. I mean, when those 87 questions, okay, well, I suppose if I had one, if there could be some sort of ringmaster about extraneous questions, that would be good, but I don't think that's going to happen, is it? I mean, that's ultimately a question for the court. So no, I don't. I mean, once you get on that litigation train, there's no stopping, and you get into this horrific big boys poker game, really, and you know, it's all about who blinks first. And you know, you get to, I got to a sort of mid-Atlantic stage where, or just before that, really, and I was, you know, I was sorely tempted to blink, but then I knew that if I did, you know, the other side would I'd never hear the end of it, and as a point, I just wasn't going to do that. So,
I mean, it's an extraordinary system whereby, in order to get justice, you have to risk your house and your whole life.
Well, I wouldn't want to, I'm not that much of a hero. It's nice of people to say that. I mean, I did have insurance against losing. However, it's not quite as simple as that. I had to dip into my own pocket for reasons I won't go into. And I am about a lot of money down. The problem is that, you know, if you win, and the other side don't pay, then you ultimately become liable for those costs. And in my case, the costs are very considerable. So there is that Damocles sword hanging around, which occasionally wakes me up early in the morning.
Okay. We have gone on much too long, I think. I want to say very, very big thank you to everybody for coming. I want to draw your attention to the link that I've given, by which people can donate to the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism. Please copy the link now, because it might disappear in a minute when we all close down. Our next event is in 2 weeks' time, and there is the Eventbrite link. It is Adi Schwartz talking about anti-Semitism in Iraq in the 1940s, which is very interesting and more contested by people who want to educate our students and our fellow citizens that it never really happened. So thank you very, very much, John. Really, really interesting. just great to hear you thinking, actually, to thinking out loud, and lots of new insight for people, I think, too. Please copy the donation link. Please come to our website and sign up for our emails, or find us on social media. Thanks very, very much.